So I'm watching this video called 10-Minute History, the Early British Empire from History Matters. Now, I believe that the UK had the largest empire in the world, I believe. Not interconnected. I believe the Mongols have the record for the largest interconnected land empire, but the UK has largest empire overall. I mean, look at all this. Fortunately, History Matters helped show this off the bat, and yeah, they just had they had the largest empire in the world, and it's just insane, and it's really due to just their great navy. Like, you've always heard of the famous saying that Britannia rules the waves, and with that power, just how they were able to overcome adversaries like Napoleon, for instance, and just securing their dominance in the sea helped really establish them as a world power. I think this is like the closest any country or nation has come to world domination. Like, ruling the world. I feel like the UK at its peak was probably the closest to ever come to that. And in Europe, there are obviously, we've seen like with Europe and the Age of Exploration era, how simply having a great navy could help spread the influence of a country. I think of like Portugal and Spain, and how they were like kind of the overseas empires before, the UK took prominence, and we saw how influential they were in history and how far they spread, and like the UK followed and just became just a juggernaut. And overall, we've seen bits and pieces of, the English around this channel. Mainly they pop up everywhere. Europe, Asia, just the American continent. They're always everywhere, but I've kind of wanted to do get a better overall picture of the entire situation, because I know bits and pieces, I know them at their peak, I know, and whatnot, but it'll be cool to see the moment it began and it kind of ended. This is a two-parter. The next video that I'll follow this is the late British Empire, so I think by the time I watch both of these videos, definitely have an overall better picture of the English Empire and whatnot. And that'll be really cool, because this is very interesting. And apparently it began in 1497, so yeah, not too far from, Columbus and whatnot. 1492, but sorry, it's just some song. So yeah, I don't really have much else to say other than I always put the link to the original videos down below, and if you want to help out this channel, I would really appreciate it if you could like, comment, subscribe. It really helps out the channel, it helps me out, and I would really appreciate it very much. With that said, without any further ado, let's get to it. Let's learn about the early British Empire by History Matters.
97, and the British Empire didn't exist, neither did Britain. England was the largest and most powerful country in the British Isles at this time. Wales, the Isle of Man and a piece of Ireland called the Pale were firmly under English control. The rest of Ireland was mostly independent, only giving lip service to the English monarchy, and in the north, Scotland remained independent and a close ally of France. King Henry VII of England wished to improve England's trading situation. The English were not exactly renowned sailors at this point, and so Henry did what everyone else did at the time, hired an Italian, a certain Giovanni Caboto. Caboto was searching for a northern route to China, but landed in North America, becoming the first European to set foot there, at least since the Vikings had 500 years earlier. Henry VII...
Oh, that's interesting. So, there's kind of a misconception at certain points in history about the discovery of America. A big one when I was a kid was Columbus discovered America. I know you probably are like, raising your fist in the air, but that was a pretty popular thing. I remember when I was a kid, like, Columbus is the guy who discovered America. Then it's like, no, the Vikings technically, You know, at least I think from like Europeans going there, and obviously the Native Americans were there before everyone else, but you know, it's kind of a misconception about the whole Columbus situation. There's a lot about Columbus that's kind of like weird facts, you know, like the whole he's the only guy who believed that the world was round and whatnot. There's a lot with him that, you know, growing as a child we were told, but growing up you realize isn't really the truth. But yeah, so back to this, I apologize.
Becoming the first European to set foot there, at least since the Vikings had 500 years earlier. Henry VII continued the long tradition of English monarchs and died before being succeeded by his son Henry VIII. Henry VIII contributed to the expansion of English holdings by incorporating Wales into the Kingdom of England and giving it representation in Parliament. In 1534, Henry split with Rome, creating the Church of England.
Yeah, mainly because he wanted to get divorced from his, you know, wife, and Anne Boleyn, I think, was the other one that he really wanted to. He basically upheaved the entire church just so he can get some, you know. But obviously, he wanted a male heir and whatnot. That's a pretty big, important, you know, push for monarchs, right, to have that. But yeah, his effects on Christianity were, yeah, you know, pretty important, even though I don't know, it's just kind of funny to think. I always think of the oversimplified thing, like his loins were on fire and whatnot.
England, which would begin the religious divide between England and Ireland. 8 years later, he had himself declared the King of Ireland, although in reality this didn't change very much. Henry was succeeded by Edward, and shortly after that came Queen Mary I, a Catholic, who married King Philip II of Spain. One important part of Mary's rule was the beginning of the Irish plantations, which saw lands belonging to Irish lords confiscated and given to the English for settlement. Mary and Philippe never had children, and so after Mary's death in 1558, the crown passed to her sister Elizabeth because the English Parliament made sure Philippe was ineligible.
I'm Dr.
Elizabeth was a devout Protestant and reinstated many of her father's laws which punished Catholics, much to the anger of Philippe, who saw himself as the defender of Catholicism. Spain held the Netherlands at this point, and the northern part, which had a large Protestant population, was rebelling against Spanish rule. England was more than happy to help undermine Spain's power, and one way the English helped the Dutch was by giving Dutch privateers shelter in English ports. So privateers were essentially pirates who had the protection of a government, and Elizabeth employed many. Spain had a growing colonial empire at this point, and there was a lot of trade, particularly in silver, between Spain and its colonies. Privateers would seize this cargo by raiding Spanish ports and ships before taking it back to England. The most famous of England's privateers is Sir Francis Drake, who conducted numerous highly profitable raids against the Spanish. He also circumnavigated the globe and even claimed land in what is now California. Beyond privateers, England also sent explorers to the New World, such as Sir Walter Raleigh, who set up a soon-to-be mysteriously abandoned colony at Roanoke Island in North America.
Yeah.
Elizabeth also...
Roanoke. Pretty famous, you know, for all the people who disappeared. And it's cool to see just kind of like, before, you know, the UK and whatnot became the power it was, Spain at one point was the top dog of Europe, you know, with their colonial overseas empires, between, and their kind of like rivalry with the, you know, Portuguese and whatnot with Portugal. And it's kind of interesting to see that this is kind of like, that it was Elizabeth kind of poking the, I guess the phrase I'm looking for is poking the bear, but essentially trying to stick it up to the Spanish, right? In this way. So that's pretty interesting.
Continued the Irish plantations to shore up the English position there. Exploration and colonisation at this time was almost always reliant on royal patronage in order to get funded. English-Spanish relations were not improved by England's moves across the Atlantic, since Spain claimed nearly all of the New World, and also losing silver was presumably not much fun for Philippe either. Relations worsened when Portugal, England's oldest ally, had a succession crisis which saw Philippe crowned its king. The final straw for Philippe was when Elizabeth had Mary, the Queen of Scots, beheaded in 1587. The reasons for this are complex, but it was essentially because Elizabeth did not want Scotland returning to Catholicism. So Philippe, now pretty fed up, ordered the creation of an armada which was to sail to the Netherlands before invading England. When the armada reached England, several skirmishes occurred, the most famous being the Battle of the Gravelines, where an English victory forced the Spanish fleet to sail around the British Isles in order to return to Spain. Storms, a lack of food and disease killed thousands on the return journey, and this failure pretty much much bankrupted Spain.
Dang.
The next year, England chose to counterattack and launched the English Armada under the command of Sir Francis Drake. The goals of the Armada were to destroy the remaining Spanish ships, stir revolt in Portugal, and intercept any Spanish silver. So, the English Armada was a complete failure and cost the lives of thousands of English sailors and was very expensive. It did, however, guarantee that England would remain independent. Towards the end of her reign, Elizabeth made one last contribution to the empire and founded the East India Company, which was given a monopoly on trade with India.
Oh, wow.
Elizabeth died childless in 1603 and was succeeded by James VI of Scotland, who was crowned James I of England.
Yeah, that's a pretty interesting situation. Like, I've heard of Elizabeth, and kind of her image is very striking, like very pale, red lips, hair, you know. It's a very famous, like, striking image of a historical figure. Yet I never really looked, like, too deep, you know, into her. But seeing just the way she essentially beat with Spain, who was a pretty, you know, prominent power in Europe, and kind of succeeded, you know, in keeping, in maintaining independence and whatnot, and even, like, I guess, you know, thwarting the Spanish attempts of, like, attacking her country was pretty interesting, I have to say. And also the establishment of the East Indian Company, which has popped up a few times. I did not know she's the one who started that. Okay, that's pretty cool. And it's interesting that at this point the English are in, like, a full-on naval, you know, power. And obviously I'm speaking with hindsight, because they're kind of naval power is kind of so associated with the UK in my head, with the English, that they're almost inseparable in my head. So, you know, knowing there's a time where they weren't really, I guess a seafaring is the word I'm looking for, or not having much of a prominent navy is a pretty different side that I'm not used to of seeing, you know?
James's early reign saw the end of the war with Spain and was marked by several attempts to kill him, most notably the Gunpowder Plot. James contributed to the empire by sponsoring colonial ventures. He sponsored another wave of plantations in Ireland, most notably the Ulster Plantation, which contained many Scottish settlers alongside English ones. James also oversaw the first permanent English settlement in the Americas, the colony at Jamestown. Next was Bermuda, followed by Plymouth, which was famously founded by the Puritans who arrived on the Mayflower.
Yes.
So Jamestown was founded by the Virginia Company of London with the goal of making its shareholders a profit. The colony was famously led by John Smith, who maintained good relations with the Native Americans.
Yeah, so also a big part with the, you know, with the expedition, the Mayflower was seeking, or at least it's been told, seeking, like, religious freedom, or the freedom of practicing religion and whatnot. Yeah, the Puritans wanted, it's been told, and when we were learning about this, that they wanted religious freedom. That was usually sometimes portrayed as just the biggest aspect of them moving around, you know, to the Americas and whatnot. But it's cool to see that there was, like, you know, the English kind of dipping their toes, as it were, into colonialism and the expansion from beyond their you know, natural home. So that's interesting. And John Smith, yeah, the most famous, you know, portrayal of him is really the Pocahontas movie, right? Which obviously it's work of fiction and whatnot, and him falling in love with Pocahontas and stuff, even though the real John Smith was, like, a middle-aged man, and, like, Pocahontas was, like, what, like a teen at most, like 12 or 13, so something like that. It's from these old videos, like the Disney compared to the actual history or something like that from many years ago. Seen videos like that. So yeah, that's just what pops in my head. This, like, different Disneyfied view of this dude and whatnot.
Women ride.
Smith was forced to return to England after being injured in a gunpowder explosion, and for a time, relations between the English and the natives remained peaceful. These good relations wouldn't last, and soon the English and natives were fighting, and after several wars, the English managed to push the natives out of the area. In order to grow the cash crops on which the colony relied, indentured servants were imported. In this context, indentured servants were people who sold...
Yeah, indentured servant. Yeah, I remember learning about this like a long time ago. And obviously had more rights than slaves. And let's see right here, indentured servants were not slaves. They had more rights than slaves and were more often than not chose to go to the Americas, and they would often serve between 4 to 7 years, so that they could actually work off, their servitude or whatnot, unlike slaves who are basically bound for life, So yeah.
themselves into a form of servitude for a period in order to pay for their voyage to the New World. Indentured servants were soon replaced with slaves from Africa since there was no obligation to free them and they were easier to obtain. Indian raids against the colony and rebellions against neglectful rule made it very difficult to make a profit, and the colony was turned over to the English crown. There were many reasons for colonial expansion. There was a strong desire to proselytize and convert the natives of the New World, which many believed would civilize them. Some undertook extremely expensive voyages of discovery, but the most common reason was money. Spain and Portugal had amassed huge wealth trading with their colonies in China, and England didn't need much convincing. Cash crops such as tobacco and sugar were extremely profitable, and even more money could be made on the return voyages via the sale of slaves to the New World, the Atlantic Triangle as it's known. Another reason was security. The money from trade, as well as large overseas populations loyal to the crown, provided extra manpower and money for wars. To support the slave trade, England established forts along the coast of Africa from which they operated, trading goods for gold, ivory and people. Slaves from Africa were also much easier to obtain than the
Yeah, the slave trade was extremely valuable to England/Britain. It is believed that between 2.5 to 3.5 million slaves were transported from Africa to the New World by English/British ships. Wow. But yeah, the profitability of the slave trade is something else. I remember... I'm graduated from university now, but I remember I took this class about African American literature, and I remember in one of the lessons that we took kind of talking about the slave trade and, just how it could, especially early on, just how profitable it actually was, which is interesting. Also, I believe that the UK outlawed slavery before America as well. I could be wrong on that way. Yeah, they did.
The indentured servants which came from England, Ireland or Scotland. This was because of the numerous major upheavals across the British Isles, such as the English Civil War, which saw the British Isles briefly become a republic under Oliver Cromwell. The Irish capitalised on a weakened English state and broke away from English rule. Cromwell brutally and swiftly put down these rebellions and seized huge chunks of land and gave it to his veterans. During the Civil War, the colonies generally sided with the monarchy, leading the English Commonwealth to blockade some of them. Cromwell briefly went to war with Spain, who ceded Jamaica, which would form the backbone of England's sugar and slave trades. So long story short, Cromwell died and the monarchy was restored under Charles II, who in terms of empire managed to gain New Amsterdam from the Dutch, which was swiftly renamed to New York. The monarchy would soon find itself in trouble again when Charles's son, James II, converted to Catholicism. Protestant England was none too pleased about this, and so some lords asked the Dutch William of Orange to become King of England, which he did in 1688. William's ascendancy to the throne caused a major French-supported uprising in Ireland, which was eventually quashed. Scotland also tried its hand at colonisation during the period by founding Nova Scotia in modern-day Canada, which was quickly lost to the French. The most notorious attempt at Scottish empire building was the founding of the colony at Caledonia in what is now Panama in 1698, which was claimed by Spain. The colony failed due to disease and a Spanish blockade, and the English refused to help because they didn't want to provoke war. What makes Caledonia so notable was the cost of its failure, since the venture had cost Scotland almost a fifth of its national wealth and bankrupted the kingdom. Thus, the Scottish and English empires at the turn of the 18th century looked like this. In return for England financing Scotland's debts, both kingdoms were unified by the 1707 Act of Union, which gave birth to Great Britain. Great Britain immediately...
Wow, that's really cool to see. Almost like... I want to get that again, and it almost seems like just a union. Very pragmatic, not one born of conquest. but, kind of mutual aid.
Wealth and bankrupted the kingdom. Thus, the Scottish and English empires at the turn of the 18th century looked like this. In return for England financing Scotland's debts, both kingdoms were unified by the 1707 Act of Union, which gave birth to Great Britain.
Yeah, and so much of the UK's history, they were in one giant thing, with Scotland and whatnot, so that's something always, like I said, like my brain kind of associates more with the later UK, at its peak glory. So sometimes learning about it in its earlier history, like, it's always kind of like a different side. Like, I'm aware of it, but it's always just unique to see. And it's cool to see the progression and the reasons why it eventually became what it became, of what I more associate with it or am more familiar with, And we're even seeing that in America as the colonies, New York and whatnot, and Jamestown, Virginia. Just, it's cool to see, just at the same time while the UK is, progressing, I'm also seeing parts of my own country, the United States, progress, like, very much intertwined, which makes sense. The colonies were a part of the UK until, the war and whatnot, and of independence.
Great Britain immediately found itself caught up in numerous European wars. From the War of the Spanish Succession, Britain gained Gibraltar in southern Spain and large swathes of French territory in Canada. Next came the War of the Austrian Succession, which wasn't very important to empire, except that it paved the way for a much more important war, the 7 Years' War. The 7 Years' War was a global conflict which saw British victory.
Yeah, we saw the 7 Years' War. We covered the Frederick the Great series from the House of History, and some videos from Old Britannia. And yeah, the 7 Years' War is just an interesting event. We mainly learned through Prussia's perspective and everything old Freddy boy went through. But yeah, it is known that the UK did also won, and that really helped solidify their overseas colonial aspects. I believe it was a big boom to them, especially at the French expense.
And saw the transfer of a great deal of North American territory to Britain from France and Spain. It should be noted here that for many
European powers particularly fought over the Caribbean sugar islands. These were incredibly valuable as a source of luxury goods, as well as a destination for slaves.
of these countries, the wars were nothing more than excuses to seize each other's territories. The war also spread to India, where the British and French were trying to squeeze each other out. The reason for this was that trade with India was incredibly lucrative. It focused mainly on textiles, spices, and the most important consumer good of all time, tea. So by the beginning of...
Yes, the tea! Another thing associated with the English, kind of like a joke, kind of one of those, for instance, for like Hispanics, it's tacos, right? We all like tacos. I think like a big like thing associated with the English is crumpets and tea and crumpets. Don't get between the English and their tea, guys. I think those are kind of funny, like, things associated with certain groups, So yeah, factories were not places where goods were made like today. They were essentially fortified warehouses from which European nations traded from.
The 7 Years' War, the East India Company had already established factories along the coastline of India, much of which was controlled by either the Mughal or Maratha empires. The company was largely independent.
Yeah, the Mughal and the Marathans we covered from some of the battles by History March and Kings and Generals. Essentially, they fought each other, but at the end it didn't matter because the UK takes it all. I forgot what was the battle we covered, but the name. But essentially, you know what I'm talking about. They fought. It didn't even really matter at the end because the UK just comes in and sweeps it all up. So the battle. Oh no! I always found that funny. They just swoop in and take it all after these other, Indian empires kind of exhaust themselves fighting one another.
and even had its own military. The company was also deeply involved in Indian politics and were very good at playing Indian lords, called Nawabs, off of each other for British benefit. Robert Clive, also known as Clive of India, led the East India Company forces there. The British won a decisive victory against the Indians at the Battle of Plassey, mostly due to some double dealing. After defeating the French, the Dutch, and later the Mughals, British territory in India looked like this. Bengal was particularly important since it had a taxable population twice the size of Britain. After the wars, the company began to levy heavy taxes against the locals, and Bengal quickly became an extremely important revenue stream for Britain. Robert Clive was for a short...
Okay, the British cash corps, the main cash corps grown in India were crops, crops. Okay, what they grew mainly were indigo, which was used to make expensive purple dye, very rare also purple dye, so that makes sense, and poppies, from which opium was extracted for the sale. That just reminded me of the Opium Wars, where the English essentially just get the Chinese high on opium. It's really evil, actually. Like, there are times no empire is has its hands clean, obviously, but there's something at times where the English could be kind of frightening if you were against them, right? It's still one of those things that stick with me. The Opium Wars and what they did, I was like, oh my gosh, you guys, that is so messed up, you know? I just got reminded of that.
Period, the governor of Bengal, and one of his policies was to force local farmers to grow opium for export to China instead of food, which meant that whenever crops failed, large numbers of Bengal...
Okay, it is believed that during the famine, up to as many as 10 million people... Oh my goodness. As a result, the company increased tax collection in order to make up for the lost revenue. Oh my, that's wild.
People starved. Britain's colonial successes in India were contrasted by its failings in North America. The number of soldiers, tax disputes, and lack of representation in the British Parliament led the 13 colonies to declare their independence. The Americans
no taxation without representation! But, yeah, back to America.
By General George Washington, who would later become the first president of the United States of America. Britain at first was able to win some major victories.
Yeah, George is interesting as a general in that, despite as many setbacks or losses he took, at the end, he never broke, and at the end was kind of just the best person to become our president in terms of just, character and humility. Obviously, the only failing is he owned slaves, but then again, I mean, granted, obviously I don't support slavery in any era, but I understand that things were different then, and that especially in the South, many were dependent on slaves, and especially in Virginia, where I believe he was from. So I get that, and that's just one failing, in my opinion, while other founding fathers like John Adams did not practice slavery, so I definitely... I get it. There's a lot to talk about, but overall, putting that aside, putting the slavery issue aside, George Washington definitely was the, perfect man to be the first president, and such a humble guy. Even just by stepping down from being president just shows his character, I think. So, I don't know, there's definitely a lot to admire about him, certainly. Really was just the perfect storm of people to make a nation. So much intelligence from the founding fathers, from Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, so much intelligence and, talent. It really was the perfect storm. It's kind of amazing.
After years of attrition, alongside the French and Spanish aiding the Americans, the British accepted American independence and lost all of this territory. The birth of the British Empire was a slow and drawn-out process. The reasons for colonial expansion were diverse, ranging from religious calling to the desire for wealth. Colonial failure led to the creation of Great Britain, but colonial success meant that warfare now had a global scope, and it became increasingly difficult for the rest of the world to stay uninvolved from European politics.
I think that's the most interesting aspect that I never thought of. The way that this colonialism essentially made wars larger in scale because of the many fronts, which in turn leads to a lot more death. I never thought about that, but yeah, that's kind of probably one of the biggest, most disastrous consequences of that growth, huh? I never thought of it like that, but that makes so much sense to me. Okay, so that was really cool. I really enjoyed this video, and it's cool to have a better, more comprehensive, overall view of the rise of the early British Empire. And I'm gonna have to, next time I cover History Matters, it's going to be about the late British Empire. I'll see you guys then.